that's funny. Thank you. Can you put the switch on? Good morning and good Sunday. It's so good to see you. More than 6 years ago, we made a circle around the outside of the sanctuary. It was the call day for the calling of a new minister, which happened to be me that day. I was advised after delivering the second sermon. I had been here for 9 days. He preached one Sunday, and then there's a series of activities and parties and get-togethers throughout the week. And then the second Sunday you preach, and you're asked to leave the premises while the congregation talks about you behind your back and decides whether or not they want to call you as their minister. And when we came back into the room and that call was made, we sang a song called Wonderful World. It was beautiful. We sang through the first verse, arm in arm, all in a circle, swaying back and forth. When it got to the second verse, we couldn't remember the words, so we just bailed. And in that moment, I fell in love. One of my favorite songs by Bob Dylan is Hard Rain is Gonna Fall. Do you know that song? Where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Where have you been, my darling young one? I've stumbled the side of 12 misty mountains. I'm so happy these days because I live in these misty mountains. And if you looked around, you might have seen the mist sort of tucking away and hiding itself in the mountains. It's the right time of year for that. Most of the time, most of the year, it's just less romantic. It's just kind of foggy when you actually live inside of that dream that we live in. And it was beautiful this morning on this gray Sunday, this spectacular average gray Sunday, as neighbors walked their dogs and got their mail and read their paper and said good morning and said good Sunday to a wonderful world. Right?
It's because of the wedding yesterday.
Okay. There are a couple of announcements today. The first and most important is that coffee hour is going to be out front on the front porch. There is food and reception set up downstairs, but it's set up downstairs for Kristen Rose's memorial service. I would invite you all to come if you'd like. It's at 1 o'clock. Kristen Rose was a member of our congregation for a brief amount of time. She's from Windsor. She passed away a few months ago and was 68 years old when she passed. She's a dancer, beautiful spirit. And I'm so glad that she was with us for a short while. I invite you to settle in and relax and get ready for Matthew Friedman. Dr. Matthew Friedman, that's medical doctor. It says PhD, but it's a medical doctor. I'm looking forward to a conversation about forgiveness and apology. A couple of events I just want to call your attention to this afternoon, today at 11:30. Leon and Joelle, I saw Joelle, will be hosting the racial justice conversations, which will continue in the parlor after today's service. I wanted to say that the wreath sale has begun, and call your attention to the write-up on the back of the order of service. I also want to announce the blood drive. There are posters that Joanne has. Joanne is in the choir. The posters are in the back of the sanctuary. If you could take one of these posters with you, Woodstock is already covered, but if you can advertise in surrounding areas, that would help us to recruit more people and to do good work with the American Red Cross. It would be lovely to continue our partnership with them. Yes. Yeah, and then I want to ask Mary and
You already so beautifully announced it. I didn't
to come up. Yeah.
I I just wanted to say, as Leon said, that the wreath sale has begun, and I will be here after church, as will Joanne, to take orders from people. So please come and see us. And Sherry, while I'm here, shall I just announce you? Will you be doing the circle dinner?
Circle dinners, yes.
Right, so Sherry will have a clipboard too. We'd love to have people sign up for the circle dinner, which will be the 14th of October. And we're going to do it as a circle dinner, as a fall get-together supper. Thanks.
Are there any other announcements? On my first day as a chaplain in the hospital, I was called to the room of a dying man. I had walked in with my lunch and a folder filled with all of the instructions about how to be a good chaplain. I had not read them yet. The doors of the elevator opened, and the attending nurse said, "Oh, good, the chaplain is here. You are needed in room 7. And I said, oh dear. Okay, at least it was room 7, so I'd have the length of the hallway to prepare my words. And I started down the hallway, and the first room I saw on my left was room 8. The next room on the right was room 7. So I took a deep breath and I walked into the room, and there were 5 men, all about 220 pounds, standing around the bedside. And they parted like the Red Sea. 5 African-American men standing around their father. And they said too, oh good, the chaplain is here. And I walked in, not knowing what I would say. As a Unitarian Universalist, I was not schooled in the traditional prayers that were expected of a chaplain, particularly in the African-American tradition. And I said, my name is Leon Dunkley. Who are you? And they introduced their father, who was a reverend. And then I said, and who are you? And they said, we are his sons. Reverend John, Reverend Adam, Reverend Jacob. I mean, each one of them was also a reverend. Sometimes you get through moments of great difficulty by just calling on grace to support you. Before I started as a chaplain, I had a training exercise in that same hospital in California. And I was following someone who was very gifted, but your gifts sometimes fail our situations. So we entered the room, and that training chaplain said, just follow what I do. And we walked in, and the beloved person in the room was also surrounded by family, 2 people this time. And the person had just passed away. And the minister walked in and said, immediately, your mother is in a better place. And I thought it odd, because I didn't know if he knew those people at all. I didn't know if he knew their theologies. And it became evident right away that he did not, because the son, who was sitting by the bedside, said, she's in a better place. And the minister said, yes. And he said, did you know my mother? He said that playfully. Harold Dean, my minister in New Jersey, asked me when I was about 12 if I knew my father. And I said, of course I know my father. You know, it's right there. And he said, do you know him as a man? And I said, no. To know someone requires a grace that over the years I have recognized as forgiveness. It's a beautiful thing to be entering into this conversation with Matt this morning about how to reconcile our feelings and be at peace with who we actually are. How do we be at peace with who we actually are?
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Good. Back in the 1970s, when I was immersed in the hippie community of Cornish, New Hampshire, I encountered a Korean face reader at a street fair in Lebanon. Traditionally, this is a 4,000-year-old, well-respected profession in Korea where face readers prophesy your future based on the tilt of an eyebrow, the angle of a nose, the shape of a chin, and so forth. On a dare from my friends, I offered myself for inspection by a tiny, wizened woman who exuded quiet dignity and commanded respect. The only thing I really remember about that encounter was that she said I would only live another 30 turbulent years and die in my early 60s. At the time, given the frenzied life I was leading, I was relieved that I would actually survive that long, since I didn't think I'd make it past 50. That was 50 years ago, and I've lived 20 more years than she had predicted. Having celebrated my 83rd birthday a few months ago, I'm still full of life and dreams about the future. But the reality is that as much as I hope to dance at each grandchild's wedding, I don't know how much more time I have left. There are many reminders of this, such as attending an increased number of funerals and memorial services for good friends and loved ones, my daily search of the Valley News obituary listings for familiar names, driving past the windows of my old office at the VA hospital that I no longer occupy, or each time someone I care for has a serious medical problem. Much has been written about a good death in which the dying individual has had the opportunity to say goodbye to loved ones and has spoken with each one of them about all that needs to be said. This includes resolving any lingering conflicts or misunderstandings while they can still be addressed directly and honestly with purpose and love. I've always regretted that I never had that opportunity with my father, who only lived 61 years and died in 1966. I was a very angry 26-year-old at that time, and much of my anger was directed towards him. I've always known that if he'd lived longer, or if I had grown up and matured much faster, that we could have had at least one conversation in which we addressed all the hot-button issues that stood between us. We might even have been able to make some sort of peace with one another and then gone on to build a loving relationship in which we both could freely participate. I don't want that to happen again. I don't want to die before I get to say everything I need to say to everyone to whom I need to say it. I want to deal with all my unfinished business while I'm still alive and able to do so. So this morning, before it's too late, I will address a major piece of unfinished business with which I have struggled for 60 years. Dr. Ira Byock, a world-renowned expert in palliative care who directed the program at Dartmouth Hitchcock for many years, has written a book about what he calls the 4 things that matter most. According to Dr. Byock, these 4 things need to be said to each loved one before they die. He even insists that you can tell a deceased loved one these 4 things, although regrettably the conversation will be one-sided. The 4 things are, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. Let me say them again. Please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. Indeed, 5 years ago, I wrote a posthumous letter to my deceased father and thanked him for all he did and tried to do for me and the many hundreds of family members, friends, and patients whom he helped as a husband, father, friend, brother, uncle, and family doctor throughout his life. I also told him how much I loved him, which was never at question, although it was a statement that was impossible for me to say while he was still alive. And I apologize that I was unable to tell him these things while he was still alive because of my anger and estrangement. So in my posthumous letter, I stated 2 of the things that Dr. Byock says matters most. I said thank you and I love you. But I couldn't say the other 2 things. You see, I'm really hung up on the forgiveness part. I couldn't say I forgive you, nor could I ask him to forgive me. It's unfinished business that I really need to figure out while I'm still alive and able to do something about it. Now, I'm not a philosopher, ethicist, or theologian, but as I understand it, there are 2 crucial conditions when considering forgiveness. The first is that you have been injured by a wrongful act. And the second is that you have the authority or moral standing to absolve the person who committed that wrongful act. According to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who led South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the termination of apartheid and the fall of the white supremacist Afrikaner regime, forgiveness is only relevant when there is a clear wrongdoer and a clear victim. Archbishop Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission addressed thousands of scenarios in which individuals confessed committing wrongful acts and acknowledged their guilt for such behavior. Wrongful acts were truly heinous events, such as murder, torture, assault, sexual violence, and the like. After perpetrators confessed their crimes and acknowledged their guilt, the victims of such crimes had the choice to forgive or not to forgive the perpetrator, and in the words of Archbishop Tutu, to declare their faith in the future of a relationship and in the capacity of the wrongdoer to make a new beginning on a course that will be different from the one that caused the wrong. Wrongdoing sometimes does occur within families, such as childhood sexual or physical abuse or emotional neglect. And under such circumstances, forgiveness is absolutely necessary to repair damaged relationships during life or at the bedside of someone facing death. But I don't think this is what Dr. Byock had in mind when he wrote about forgiving the other and asking for the other's forgiveness. It appears to me that his focus is not on wrongful acts, but primarily on relationship problems that have caused anger, pain, regret, neglect, lost opportunities, and lack of communication. And I think that for many of us, unfortunately, these are not infrequent occurrences in difficult relationships with loved ones or in relationships with difficult loved ones. Although we may feel wronged or believe that the other is in the wrong, the root cause of these damaged relationships rarely rises to the level of what Archbishop Tutu would consider a wrongful act. That was certainly the case for me. Both my father and I had made many mistakes throughout our relationship. Not only couldn't we talk about them, but we really couldn't even recognize them. There was never a malicious intent by either of us, and I can now see that the deep love that we shared for one another could never be recognized or openly expressed because it was completely obscured by anger, pain, lack of empathy, fear of rejection, inability to communicate, and a retreat into a malignant silence that persisted until his death. The last straw that made reconciliation completely impossible was my father's catastrophic error of judgment when, against medical advice, he removed my suicidal brother Dick from the safety of a psychiatric ward and took him to the complicated and difficult environment of his home. Some weeks later, after my suicidal brother Dick successfully managed to kill himself, my relationship with my father also died. We couldn't really support one another and barely went through the motions. Looking back, my father's horrible mistake to remove my brother from the hospital was definitely a wrong decision, but it wasn't a wrongful act. He genuinely believed, as a superb doctor who had saved countless lives, that he was in the best position to save my brother. There was no malice in his behavior, just a gross lack of judgment and a tragically misguided love. As for forgiveness, he could never forgive himself and died 15 months later from what I now recognize was a broken heart. The second thing to consider about forgiveness is to identify who is the injured party. Who has the moral authority to dispense forgiveness and under what conditions? Contrary to my own beliefs for many years, the moral implications of my brother's suicide have never been about me. They have always been about my father and my brother. I've never had the moral standing to dispense or withhold forgiveness. I was collateral damage, but not a principal player. Anyone who has lost a loved one to suicide has suffered greatly. Besides the terrible loss, there is an overwhelming burden of guilt based on the usually erroneous assumption that they could have prevented the suicide had they behaved differently and taken certain actions or not taken other actions when it might have mattered most. But such pain, excruciating as it might be, does not confer moral authority. So since my brother's suicide was not the result of a wrongful act by my father, and even if it had been, I've never had the moral authority to forgive him for what happened, the dispensing or withholding of forgiveness on my part would have been presumptuous and definitely not appropriate. In other words, had there actually been an opportunity for a meaningful conversation before he died, Ira Byock's recommendation that I forgive my father and ask him to forgive me would have been irrelevant and would not have promoted reconciliation. So I asked myself, if both of us had been able and willing to speak openly and honestly at that time, and if forgiveness was not appropriate, what might I have done to try to repair our damaged relationship? As I was casting about, looking for answers to this question, I reached for Aaron Lazar's book entitled On Apology. Aaron was a very wise, funny, and compassionate mentor during my psychiatric residency at the Mass General Hospital, and the role model whom I always sought to emulate. He finished his illustrious career as chancellor at the University of Massachusetts. Anyway, according to Dr. Lazar, an apology is an encounter between two parties in which one acknowledges responsibility for an offense or grievance and expresses regret or remorse to the second party. Whereas forgiveness is a one-sided process which strives to release a wrongdoer from the burden of guilt or shame, both parties must participate in an apology. Apologies can serve many purposes, such as reversing the damage that was done, healing a wound that will not heal spontaneously, restoring safety to a relationship, and opening the way for meaningful dialogue. The apologizer accepts the risk of rejection by the offended party. Despite this, He proceeds with the apology because of the hope that there will be a significant reduction or even letting go of the anger, estrangement, silence, and pain that have come to characterize the ruptured relationship. But there are no guarantees. The apology may not be accepted, and the apology may even backfire so that the atmosphere becomes more toxic than before. In the case of my father and me, my apology should not begin with a focus on my brother's suicide. It should focus on us. I would express my remorse and acceptance of responsibility for all that I had done to damage our relationship. Without any expectation of reciprocity from my father, I would apologize for my role in perpetuating the anger, pain, emotional withdrawal, lack of empathy, refusal to communicate, and sustaining of the malignant silence that persisted for many years until his death. And I would say these things with the full understanding that there were no guarantees that my father would welcome my apology, let down his guard, and trust the sincerity of my words. Indeed, I would have no reason to believe that just because I was ready to change our relationship, that he would joyfully accept my apology and instantly take his own steps to move things in a new direction. But I could not permit these risks and uncertainties to prevent me from making the apology, because the apology would have been unquestionably an essential first step if I ever hoped to jumpstart a new beginning. Furthermore, I would have to recognize that if my apology was accepted, it would only be the beginning, the opening of a door that had been locked for decades. Next, I would need to go through that door if I hoped to make things better. Only after crossing the threshold would I be able to thank my father for all he had done for me and for so many others throughout his life. And most importantly, I would finally be able to tell him how much I loved him and to express my profound sorrow that it had taken me so long to get to this point. And so, my friends, it has taken me 60 years to find a way to address this unfinished business. In this imagined conversation with my father, I did not know whether we would have been able to take the next step, to jointly grieve for my brother and to support one another in the process. That is something I will never know. But by telling my father, thank you, and I love you, I would have reached a point that I never thought possible. I would have lovingly attempted to resolve some crucial unfinished business. And even by imagining such an encounter, I've been able to set aside decades of anger. I've allowed myself to understand at the most basic level how much my father really tried to do his best, to try to do the best he could for my brother and for all the rest of us as well. Tragically, the best he could do was misguided, woefully inadequate, and led to catastrophic consequences. And he had to live with the acknowledgement that he had failed at such a critical time. My biggest regret is that I was too angry and self-absorbed to recognize his moral pain and extreme despair. My regret is that I wasn't there to provide love and empathic support at a time when he needed it most. And that's what I wish we could have talked about before he died. That's my unfinished business. Here are some final thoughts. Getting back to that Korean face reader who erroneously predicted that I would die in my 60s, some will say that the 4,000-year-old Asian tradition of face reading is really a lot of bunk. That it's nothing more than ignorant superstition that's been hardwired into Korean traditional beliefs. Cynics might even go so far as to assert that successful practitioners of face reading are nothing more than crafty and intuitive scam artists who make excellent poker players. But I don't agree. I believe that old Korean face reader really knew her stuff. I believe that had she subsequently had the opportunity to re-examine my face after all the love and wonderful years with Gayle and my family, and after I had expelled the mountain of rage and anger that I'd been carrying for decades, that she would have predicted a much longer life expectancy for me. I also believe that what we're really talking about is not the face, but the heart. It's not about a change in facial physiognomy, the angle of a cheekbone, the clench of a jaw, or tilt of an eyebrow. No, It's about profound and hard-won changes in the heart, massive changes in the capacity for empathy, compassion, and love. That's what I think this is really about. So in closing, and circling back to Ira Byock's 4 things that matter most, I believe the thank you and I love you are the most important things that we need to tell each other at crucial moments, and especially at the end of life. Apology can open the door, but it only really counts if it leads to the overdue conversation that needs to take place. Likewise, forgiveness is only important when wrongful acts have occurred that must be acknowledged and addressed, but it is also only an initial step that must be followed by a meaningful dialogue. In other words, both apology and forgiveness by themselves can only get us so far. Only love can carry us past all the deeply regrettable experiences that have resulted from the messiness of our lives and the cumulative consequences of all the mistakes and bad decisions we've made along the way. Only love can make it possible to reach our emotional and spiritual destinations. Only love can enable us to complete all our unfinished business. Thank you.
I forgive you. Will you forgive me? Thank you. I love you. A great teacher once said that forgiveness happens in its own time. Our job is to open the door for its possibility. May we do so in kindness and in goodness and in grace. May it be so. Blessed be. And amen.